Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. Hope you've been having a good day and a good week. Today, I want to talk about a couple of works of contemporary fiction, two novels that I recently read. And because I read more nonfiction than fiction, and when I do read fiction, it's usually the acknowledged classics or works of literature and all that. So when I do venture into contemporary fiction, I find I'm usually a little behind the curve. I'm reading books that were very popular or were bestsellers last year or the year before or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And sometimes I'm a little adrift, in order to kind of focus on the stuff that might, really be worth reading. I'll rely on things like the New York Times book review. I'll rely on the New York Review of Books, the TLS. I'll listen to what some of you have to say. I'll listen to some of the booktubers, and they might mention some books that sound interesting to me. I'm always fascinated when I get to read interviews with authors, and they're always asked what their favorite books are, and I get a lot of information from that. And I think I mentioned this once before. Obama puts out this wonderful reading list every year, and the man has exquisite taste in literature. So I have to rely on that kind of stuff, so I kind of feel my way around. And so with that in mind, there are two novels that I recently read. I read them back to back, and they were both bestsellers and award winners. They both won a number of awards last year. So again, I'm a little behind the curve. I suspect that many of you have already read these novels and possibly even posted about them and discussed them. I haven't looked at that. I haven't researched that yet or done any looking into that because I wanted my opinions to come across kind of unadulterated. And then I'm going to start looking at other booktubers and see what they had to say about these two books and kind of compare notes. So anyway, and the two books are these: Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane and Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. And as I said, both of these books won numerous awards. In fact, Prophet Song won the Booker Prize for 2023. Both of them were New York Times bestsellers. Both authors are, they've both written, these are not their first books, especially Dennis Lehane. Some of the books he's written have been made into movies. Mystic River was one. I think the other one was Gone Baby Gone. Yes, not exactly uplifting material, but he does kind of explore the darker side of human society. And Paul Lynch he's an Irish writer. I see the names of some of his novels here prior to this one, which also won awards. They sound very intriguing. On the strength of this novel, the experience I had reading this, I would certainly look into them again. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about these two novels, and I noticed they both had something in common, which didn't strike me immediately until I had finished them. And I started thinking about it. I thought, oh my goodness, these two novels touched upon a very common theme, even though the stories they tell are very, very different. But let me just start by giving a quick summary of this. I'll be careful not to include any spoilers for those of you who have not read it yet. Small Mercies takes place in Boston about 1974. And at that time, that's when the courts came down with this decision that there was too much segregation in the cities, and especially large cities, and especially Boston. And so in a bid to kind of to develop a kind of forced integration, this is when busing began. Now, for those of you too young to remember what that was, busing was this idea that to take black students from black schools and black neighborhoods and bus them into white neighborhoods to go to the white schools, and take the white students from the white schools and the white neighborhoods and bus them into the black neighborhoods. And the idea here was it was supposed to kind of even things out. Whether that was successful or not is something for another time to discuss. But that's kind of the background of the action in this novel. And so it takes place during the summer. And as the fall is approaching, the school year is going to begin, and this busing experiment is going to start. And all the attention is on the white neighborhood in Boston. I think it's South Boston. And you can the racial tensions are rising. The racism is becoming more and more obvious. People aren't even trying to hide it anymore. And that's like the background noise of this novel. In the foreground, though, is the story of a woman she's been married twice. Her first husband, I don't recall what happened to him, but he's not even kind of relevant to the story. But her second husband has just left her. She had a son who has come back from Vietnam, and no sooner does he return, he ends up overdosing on drugs. He dies of drug abuse. I'm not giving anything away. That kind of happens before the story begins. So it's just her now and her daughter. And her daughter is a teenager, and she's starting to push back and getting a little rebellious. And her daughter is hanging around with some people that mom doesn't necessarily approve of. And then one day, her daughter says, after school, she's going to hang out with some of her friends. And the mom says, okay. And the girl does not come home. And the mother waits 24 hours. The next day, her daughter is still not returned. She calls the police. The police, say we have to wait 48 hours before we take any action. The mother starts contacting her daughter's friends, and no one seems to know anything. And that's the driving narrative of this. It's a woman trying to find her daughter. And so it makes this kind of like a mystery story. What happened to her daughter? Where is she? And she gets involved with various very interesting characters. A lot of them of kind of underworld figures. She gets involved in some corrupt police and everything else, just trying to work this out. Meanwhile, the drums of racism are getting louder and louder and louder. It's very tense. It's very troubling. It's a very violent novel. It's hard hitting. It's two-fisted. The prose is uncompromising, kind of a cross between Ernest Hemingway and Mickey Spillane. This is tough guy talk, but at the same time, it's beautifully written, and the narrative is very strong, and it pulls you right along. Wonderful novel. I strongly recommend it. I've got more to say about this one, but before I get to that, I want to talk about this one, Prophet Song. Now, this story takes place in Ireland in the not too distant future. And as I've noticed, a lot of books that take place in the future, either the near future or the far future, the common theme is dystopias. And this book takes place at that very moment when a relatively stable society slides into a dystopian, authoritarian, vaguely fascist government. You never quite understand what the politics are or what's happening behind the scenes, but day by day, things get darker. There are food shortages, prices begin to increase. There's some rioting in the streets. The powers that be are responding to the rioting with more and more force. Pretty soon, bombs are going off and neighborhoods are being destroyed and everything else. That's the background. The world is, or at least Ireland, is descending into some kind of fascist state. In the foreground is a story of a family. And as the political tensions are rising, the father of the family goes off to work that day. He knows he's being followed by the police, and he never returns. And then it's a fairly large family. I think there was 4 people in the family, the mother and the 4 children. One of the oldest son, he too kind of vanishes. He essentially runs away, and she's not sure where he is. And then as the social chaos increases, phone lines go down. She can't get a hold of anybody. Local authorities are being denied access to important files. Transportation becomes impossible, and this woman's entire life is crashing down around her. And she's got she too has a teenage daughter who is also becoming rebellious. But they have to cling together because she also has a newborn child. And it's just as this world is falling apart. This is a terrifying book, and the future that it describes it's pretty. You don't have to suspend much belief to imagine what this would be like. I think Lynch does a wonderful job of imagining a society in freefall because of political forces beyond anyone's control. Very good novel. Now, I read both of these novels back to back, all right? And I read this one first, and then I read this one. Because of that, it took me a while to get into this one. I was thrown a little bit because the style of Prophet Song is very different from the style of Small Mercies. As I said, Small Mercies is written in that tough guy, hard as nails kind of prose. Prophet Song, though, is written in a kind of a poetic voice. Not quite stream of consciousness, but a little bit. And because I think what's going on here is that in Tender Mercies, or Small Mercies, I'm sorry, in Small Mercies, the story it involves outside forces coming down on this woman who's trying to maintain what's left of her family. And she's fighting against those forces. And there's a lot of characters that come into her life and that she encounters and she has to deal with. In Prophet Song, it's a much more internalized story. And so in that regard, as I said, it's almost like stream of consciousness. So to go from the hard-hitting, tough guy, kind of poetic, it's quite a transition. I think I should have maybe waited a day after I finished this to pick up this one, because when you get that kind of change in style, it can be pretty jarring. But eventually I got into the rhythms of this, and I really began to enjoy it, and I was very much moved by it. And what do these two books have in common? You might have already figured it out. Both stories deal with women whose families are disintegrating. They both deal with women who are dealing with existential threats to the stabilities of their own lives. In this case, the existential threat is racism, systemic racism. And in this one, the existential threat is fascism, authoritarian government. And in both stories, these women, mothers of families, their lives and identities are rooted in their families. And these existential threats are tearing their families apart. And it's how these two women deal with that. And so in that regard, these two novels, very different settings. One takes place back in the 1970s, the other takes place sometime in the future, and yet the same kind of, the same thing is being investigated or is being explored. The family unit is disintegrating as society is disintegrating. And how is this dealt with? Or can it be dealt with? And how will that end? So, and both Paul Lynch and Dennis Lehane, they do a wonderful job in a kind of exploring this stuff. So, again, I would recognize, or I would recommend both novels. They're very good, very well written. These two authors are quite serious and they know their business. That's not to say there aren't occasional false notes. In this one, the mother, in trying to find her daughter, she encounters some pretty tough characters. And there are moments in this one, she seems to suddenly have some kind of Hulk-like strength. It seems to me at the beginning of the novel, I was left with the impression she was kind of a petite woman, a good Irish woman. But suddenly, later on she starts encountering these big tough guys and she's like tossing them around like rag dolls. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know, am I missing something here? It's not to say a woman couldn't hold her own in a fight, but it just seemed a little unlikely, all right? But not enough to throw off the novel. And again, it's not the main point here. So the novel is able to carry through even with that little mistake. In Prophet Song, there are also a couple of false notes here where Paul Lynch, at one point in the book in particular, the mother and the daughter are having a conversation. And it just comes across kind of stilted, kind of unbelievable, and not the kind of conversations one might actually witness between a mother and her teenage daughter. It was just, I don't know, he was having an off day when he wrote those couple of pages. But again, not enough to harm the novel, and it certainly deserved all the literary rewards that it got. So anyway, these two books, Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane and Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, they both deal in one way or another with the very crisis that we're all facing now. There are existential threats to the stability of our societies and our families, and how are we going to deal with that? And these two authors attempt if not a solution to that problem, a sympathetic observation of that problem. That's all I've got for you now, and I'll talk to you again later.